Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Radcliffe Chambers Pupillage Q&A event. I'm Matt Mills, and I'm a junior in Chambers. I'm also on our pupillage and mini pupillage committees, and I'm delighted to be joined by two of my fantastic colleagues. Kate Selway is one of our superstar QCs in Chambers. Not only does she have a booming chancery practice, but she's also the head of our pupillage committee. And during her time in Chambers, she's read hundreds of applications, conducted dozens of interviews, so she can give us a real insight into what you need to do to shine. We also have Dan Thorpe with us. Dan's one of our brilliant new junior tenants who joined us in October. He's here to tell you what it's really like to do pupillage in a pandemic and how it feels to take your first steps as a self-employed barrister. Now, with those instructions out of the way, let's turn to tonight's programme. This evening we'll have three parts. So firstly, I'll be interviewing Dan about his experiences getting pupillage, doing pupillage, and then becoming a junior tenant. Secondly, I'll then interview Kate about her practice as a QC, and in particular, what we look for in prospective pupils. And then thirdly, we'll have an open Q&A session where I'll put your questions to Kate and Dan. Now, on the Zoom function, you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do use it at any point tonight to type a question because we want you to get involved. Don't worry, only we'll see what you type, so you don't have to worry about what other people might see. We're very happy to take your questions and we look forward to doing so. Without further ado, let's get cracking. Dan, how are you doing?
Yes, Matt, very well, thanks. Looking forward to your incisive questioning.
Good, I'm glad to hear it. Let's start from the very beginning. Could you just tell us a bit about your background? So where are you from, for example?
Yes, well, as my accent might betray, I'm from the northwest of England, from Manchester originally. I guess from there, I went to study law at undergraduate level at Downing College, Cambridge. I did an LLM, so a Masters in Law, which specialised in international commercial litigation at UCL. And then I did what was then called the BPTC, but the bar course at BPP London. Before then working for a year for pupillage, but I imagine we might touch on that slightly later.
We will, thank you very much. So let's go slightly back a couple of steps. What made you study a master's degree?
Yeah, I guess there were two reasons really. The first was that potentially, slightly sadly, I enjoyed various parts of my law degree, and that gave me a chance to focus more on the strands that I did particularly enjoy. So the LLM was focused, as I said, on international commercial litigation. That, to break that down a bit, my modules centered around commercial remedies, international and commercial trusts, and that sort of thing. The second, and I guess perhaps more cynically, but relevant given who the attendees are tonight, I felt my CV was ripe for a bit of a boost in terms of qualifications and experience, and given that I just finished an undergraduate degree, a master's was a natural next step.
Great. And how did you pick the bar course provider that you went to, which I think you said was BPP?
Yeah, well, the first thing was that I was keen to study down in London. Not being from London myself, there was a temptation to go back up to Manchester because at least when I enrolled on it, there was a disparity between how expensive the course fees were. But by way of some sort of, it was a competition that BPP ran, and I'm sure similar things are still in existence. They offered me, or the London Law School offered me a bit of money off. And again, it was nothing more detailed than that, really.
Oh, great. Well, let's move on now to pupillage applications. So can you tell us what stage were you at when you applied for pupillage?
Yeah, so my first pupillage applications were in the final year of my undergraduate law degree. So that would have been in the application window in 2017. And I just submitted a couple of applications that year to sets that I'd done many pupillages at, again, that year. And my rationale there was, well, why not? Nothing to lose and a bit of experience to gain. They weren't successful. I did get a couple of first round interviews, but was rejected at that stage. I mean, and then I followed that up the next year during my master's degree. and sent out a few more applications to a few more sets. Was slightly more successful in terms of getting more interviews, and I think one second round interview, but again, that wasn't successful. And then it was the third year, so during the bar course, during which I applied to Radcliffe for the second time, I should add, having been rejected the year before, and here I am.
Great. And how did you juggle doing pupillage interviews and, let's say, the bar course in your third attempt?
Yeah, it was tricky actually. Pupillage applications are sort of very labour intensive, stakes are high, and whilst they're obviously a long-term priority in terms of your future, but the problem always is that in terms of short-term priorities, so essay deadlines, university deadlines, etc., where it's very difficult to balance them all. I think probably like most people, it was a few late nights, truthfully speaking, and a little more last minute than I would have hoped, but I think people just find a way, and I sort of found a way at the time.
You mentioned that you applied to Radcliffe twice. What made you do that?
So it was towards the end of my degree, my undergrad degree, when I was thinking about masters, etc. And I realised that I was more interested in what we generally refer to as private law, or the law of obligations, and that's equity and trust, contract, tort, the law of property, restitution, the list goes on. But that sort of interest directed me naturally to the Chancery Bar. And I should say that that's probably, I mean, the word Chancery's bandied around quite a lot. It's a good example, I guess, of long-established jargon, which isn't often, or too often actually explained. I mean, it sort of encompasses everything I've set out there in terms of subject matter. And that's what, I guess, directed me towards Radcliffe. And it's become clear, having been in practice now for a few months, that at chambers like ours, the junior practice does involve all of those subjects that I sort of mentioned, and that's what makes it ultimately, I guess for me, enjoyable, rewarding.
Great. Can we move now to pupillage itself? So how did you prepare for pupillage, or what advice would you give for people considering pupillage?
Yeah, so I guess there are two ways to look at this, really. And the first is sort of long term, in terms of preparing for pupillage. And I imagine a few people listening are in this category, where applications are sort of in the offing, and people are trying to sort of bolster their CVs and get experience relevant to pupillage in that way. And it's sort of the types of activities people can do are well publicised, such as meeting, debating, that kind of hands-on public speaking experience. There are a couple of other things which I think people will be well advised to look into, such as work with some of the pro bono charities or pro bono institutions like Advocate and the Free Representation Unit. The Free Representation Unit being something that I did. So there's all that kind of work, which I think is very useful. The second answer, and I guess this is a shorter term answer, and is perhaps relevant to people who have already obtained pupillage, or people that aren't studying but need something to do for a period of time. I had about a year of free time before starting at Radcliffe in October 2020, and got a job as paralegal at a boutique law firm. And I think that was really key in setting me up for pupillage. Again, it's not a necessity by any stretch of the imagination, but in terms of work experience, hands-on practical experience of litigation, it really was vital. So if people can find opportunities like that, things where they'll be handed a lot of responsibility, rather than a sort of standard paralegal job at maybe a larger firm, I think that would be my suggestion.
Thanks very much. And moving on to your particular pupillage, what type of work did you do in your first 6 months?
Yeah, so my first 6 months were focused exclusively on shadowing and learning from my supervisors. So I had two supervisors for 3 months each. My first focused very much on private client disputes. So that's disputes involving trusts, disputes involving wills. And my second supervisor did a lot of the same work, but also did a few big pensions disputes and a lot of landlord and tenant work. In terms of, as a general rule, my supervisors would send me the same instructions and papers that they had received from solicitors, say, for example, to draft a legal opinion or an advice, and they basically let me have a crack at it alongside them, and then we'd compare the finished product afterwards, which was incredibly useful, obviously, to compare my attempt to the, I guess you'd say, the real Macaulay.
Great, thank you very much. And can you tell us a bit about your second 6 months of pupillage?
Yeah, and again, the second 6 months in some ways carried on in a similar way. My supervisors, I had two supervisors for 3 months. They both this time focused on insolvency disputes and commercial disputes, which is very useful for me. And I think and perhaps Kate might give more information on this, but I think it is an aim of Chambers to make sure pupils are exposed to as broad a practice range as possible. But in another way, the second 6 was markedly different, and that's because things became, I guess, a little bit more real, in that I was able to take on my own accept my own instructions and take on my own cases in my own name. Now, obviously, this was incredibly daunting. But great experience, sort of baptism of fire, if you like. I was there in various county courts, High Court a couple of times, learning on the job, which again, as we might talk about later, is something I think marks Radcliffe out amongst its competitors.
Great, thank you. And in both the first 6 and the second 6, what were your typical working hours?
So generally, as a general rule, I think 9 to 6 was pretty standard. I think it depends very much on supervisors. My supervisors with me were sort of quite sensible, realistic, that as long as I was getting the work done on schedule in time and sort of was working hard enough, I guess, they were pretty happy to be flexible. Yeah, I mean, my second 6 was a bit more similar to my current practice, where basically, again, you have a bit more freedom because you're doing the work yourself. You get a bit of a longer leash, but as a general rule, I'd say 9 to 6 was pretty standard. Great.
Now, you were a pupil from 2020 to 2021. We have to mention it. How did COVID affect your pupillage?
Yeah, it was a strange year, I think, to do pupillage. But I guess the first thing to say is that I didn't have a non-COVID pupillage year with which to compare it to. So it's difficult in some ways to answer that question. But I suppose, like many things, the effects were profound in some ways, but not in others. For example, before I started, I had quite a detailed conversation with Chambers' CEO, Fiona, who made it very clear to me that pupillage was going to be on my terms to a certain extent, in terms of whether I wanted to be in the office despite the health risk, or whether I would prefer to work from home, whether I had any specific circumstances which meant that coming in might not be an option for me. My personal preference, and I did feel comfortable making this clear, was to come into Chambers and be around, although it was also made very clear to me that that wasn't, in the current circumstances, an exception. So I came into Chambers, as a result, my supervisors, or I was allocated supervisors, I think, who were more keen on, or more frequently travelling into Chambers. And as a result, I think my learning from my supervisors wasn't necessarily affected, or wasn't affected at all, actually, because my relationship with them was, I think, as it would have been before the pandemic hit. Obviously, in terms of other effects, Chambers was a lot quieter than I think it would otherwise be. Just generally, things were a lot quieter, and maybe there wasn't as much scope to meet clients, meet other members of chambers, which was a shame. But again, in terms of my development as a pupil and now barrister, I think the way Chambers set things up was conducive to me getting the best training possible, really.
Thanks. And you mentioned obviously doing quite a bit of work for yourself in your second six. Did you have any sort of support in Chambers from either other members or other tenants to help you with that?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the big things which made pupillage during the pandemic a lot easier than it might have otherwise been. I think Chambers promotes very much, or at least I have created my own policy, if it's not an official policy, of knocking on people's doors, people like yourself, as you know, and people like Kate, who's also smiling, of knocking on people's doors and sticking my head in, just asking what are probably fairly basic questions, but I still get invaluable help and guidance. But separately to that, the junior tenants in Chambers, again, like yourself, Matt, make clear from day one that they're always reachable via phone or via Microsoft Teams. And I think it's that sort of camaraderie, I guess you could call it, which really is the support that's key when you sort of finding your way through various cases and things which you haven't seen before.
That's good to hear. I'm glad you found it useful. One of the really important things about pupillage is obviously the tenancy decision process. How did you find it at Radcliffe? Yeah,
I mean, look, you can't really, there are no two ways about it. It's quite a stressful time. It comes around 8 or 9 months in, by which time I think you feel like you have sort of got your foot in the door a little bit, but faced with the prospect of that door potentially closing. But it was as sort of fair and open as I think it could have been in the circumstances. I'd throughout pupillage received feedback from my supervisors, I think was transparent and fair, like regular meetings with all of them and formal and informal discussions about how things were getting on. And I was confident that what they were telling me was exactly what they were telling people like yourselves on the pupillage committee. And so when the decision came around, again, although it was slightly fraught for obvious reasons, I mean, I sort of felt well advised, or at least like nothing had sort of been kept behind the scenes. So I was sort of as confident as you could be, but now I found it fair, transparent, and here I am.
And we're delighted that you're here with us. Let's move on then to the tenancy part of the process. How have you found the transition from being a pupil to a junior tenant?
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to say that old cliche about it being sort of evolution rather than revolution, I should say. I think because I've been practicing since April, but being a tenant since October, the step up in terms of, it wasn't a sort of watershed moment where on the 30th of September, I was a pupil, and on the 1st of October, everything changed. It sort of, life carried on, except now you know, I wasn't expecting feedback from anybody. I know more. I felt like there were no more assessments or hoops to jump through. And I suppose a practical sort of obvious thing is that you get a bit more freedom. For example, I don't tend to wear a suit every day in Chambers anymore. That felt like a bigger milestone than perhaps actually having my name on the board outside the door was. But yeah, it felt a lot like life was carrying on, and it was time to sort of get your head down and give things a proper go.
Talking about tenancy, what kind of cases have you worked on since you've become a tenant, Dan?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the variety of cases that as you'll know, Matt, the juniors in Chambers get. So today, for example, I've been looking at, I've got a host of winding up petitions that are being heard on Wednesday, which are court proceedings which put companies into compulsory liquidation. I've also had some possession possession matters to look at, where landlords are trying to essentially kick their tenants out for not paying rent. There's other stuff which is sort of advising on breaches of contracts or misrepresentation claims. There have been claims relating to the validity of people's wills. There have been other things like boundary disputes, easements, and that kind of thing. And it's a variety of helping to draft proceedings, and draft claim form particulars of claim, advising on merits, giving legal advice, and of course appearing in court, which is what the job's all about, I guess.
Speaking about court, how often are you in court, do you think?
So I'm probably in court at least 3 days a week, but often 4, apart from this week, where I've only been in court once, or last week, I should say. I think that's something that people might want to bear in mind. I know juniors at other chancery sets see less court work than we typically might, but I'd say I was in court on average 3 to 4 times a week.
And what would you say your average working hours now that you're a tenant?
Yeah, I'd like to say 9 to 6. I tend to find my day doesn't really start until 11, but that's more my own aversion to an early morning. But I'd say, I mean, they're completely flexible. And I think that's one of the perks of doing the job. You have your diary, and obviously there are certain things like court hearings which are not movable or flexible, but pretty much everything else is. So I mean, my hours are long enough to make sure I do a good enough job, but in terms of when they are during the day, it really could be whenever.
We've just got time for 2 more questions. So the penultimate question: what's the best part of your job?
The best part, well, I think for me personally, it is that freedom, that level of freedom. I like not having a boss. I like not answering to anybody. That might say a lot about me, but I think it's the freedom. I think it's the ability to structure your days as you like. It's the ability to, within certain constraints, obviously those constraints being what areas of law members of chambers practice in, to develop a practice down a certain route. And I think it's that independence, really, those sort of hallmarks of self-employment.
On the flip side, what would you say is the most challenging part of the job?
Well, yeah, again, as they say, with great freedom comes great responsibility. And I suppose it's something that I didn't really think about that much before I started, but it's the flip side of that freedom of being self-employed. There is a sense of, I guess, when I started being a tenant, when the pupillage award stopped, you think, well, crikey, there's not necessarily any guaranteed salary or income at the end of this month, so I need to start working. I need to take responsibility for my cases, for my practice. And I should say, from speaking to people again like yourself, Matt, and juniors above me in chambers, I don't think that's necessarily a massive concern at our chambers. I think the junior end's very busy, but I think that is hard, and it's that ownership of your work, which maybe you don't get if you are employed, and that constant feeling of maybe I ought to be doing something more, and not being able to switch off as a result. But that is something which I'm hoping to find an adequate balance between over the next few months and years.
Great, and I look forward to you developing your practice in the next couple of years. So thanks very much, Dan. That's part 1 of our evening over. Let's move on to part 2, my interview with the head of our pupillage committee, Kate Selway. So having enjoyed the delights of the Christmas season, we are now well and truly into pupillage season. So to kick things off, Kate, could you please briefly summarise our pupillage application process?
Yes, of course. As I expect a lot of our viewers will know, we are in the Pupillage Gateway. And so the first thing to say is that applications have already opened. They opened last week, and there's a strict deadline, as I'm sure all the viewers know. We close that deadline in accordance with the Gateway guideline at 2 p.m. on the 9th of February. So the first thing to say about prospective applicants is do be very much aware of all the deadlines. Sadly, it has proven to be the case in perhaps not last year, but certainly a number of the years that I've been involved in, that people do miss that deadline. It is absolutely imperative not to miss the deadline. The process itself, we ask for a CV and a covering letter, and you can read about what we expect to see in that in much more detail in both the Gateway guidance and guidance that you can also find on our Chambers website in the pupillage section. But to just give you a brief overview, after we've received your CV and covering letter, those are considered by 4 members of a pupillage committee, and we then decide to hold first round interviews for approximately 30 candidates, and those will be approximately 15, as I said, 15 minutes. And then if you get through that round, we hold a much more detailed interview of approximately an hour or so for some 10 candidates, in advance of which those candidates will have had a written opinion to prepare on a legal problem. And shortly in advance of their 1-hour interview, they will also have been asked to prepare for a mock conference. And at the interview, one of the panel will be the solicitor, one will be the client, and the candidate will take on the role of the barrister. We consider those 10 detailed second round applications, and then we make our decision.
Great, thanks very much. Let's sort of break it down into stages. Do you have any tips for the CV and covering letter stage?
Yes, I think I've got perhaps 3. It might turn into 4 tips. I think the first tip is please, please, please avail yourself of the information that is available on both the Gateway and, more importantly, in our pupillage policy brochure, which you can find on the website, because that gives an awful lot of detail about precisely what we're looking for. We set out the criteria we're looking for, and we mark the forms and we mark the interviews in accordance with those published criteria. So we like to be as transparent as possible. So there's a lot of information out there. Tip number 1, please get to grips with all that information. My second tip is a much more practical one, really. When you are preparing your CV and covering letter, at some point during that process, put yourself in our position, put yourself in the position of the person or people who are going to be reading that form, and consider that they are likely to be reading dozens and dozens, if not over 100, maybe 200 of these applications. So bear that in mind. With that in mind, I think it's very important to state, please use good grammatical English. Please present it nicely. Please be concise and to the point. And my third tip is something to throw back in the candidate's court. When you're preparing your CV and covering letter and you've looked at all the criteria and you've understood what we've wanted, you yourself need to be a good judge of when a covering letter is too long, too short, or just right. So it's a sort of art, not a science. And there's no magic answer for the perfect covering letter. So yes, as I said, you need to be your own judge in considering ultimately how long and how detailed that information should be.
Thanks very much. Does it offer any advantage to do a law degree as opposed to a non-law degree?
Interesting question. I didn't do a law degree, and I think I did a history degree, and then I spent a number of further years studying history, and eventually thought I needed to do something to earn a living. I think one of the advantages for me was that history was my first love. I loved doing my degree. I loved doing my graduate study. And I would encourage anyone who's doing, if we've got a viewer who hasn't even studied a law degree yet, do what you love most. You definitely do not have to do a law degree to apply for and be successful. Certainly not in these chambers. We've got plenty of non-lawyers. You know, if you do a law degree, you know, fantastic, brilliant. You know, and you want to go on and do graduate study, also fantastic and brilliant. But it's absolutely, we have noticed that, for example, we would have brilliant applicants who've done a law degree. Sometimes the applicant who hasn't done a law degree but has done something else first and is therefore a little bit older. Sometimes we find that extra maturity means that they perform better in interview because they're a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more confident. But the short answer to the question is no.
Great, thank you. Let's go back to our pupillage process. Do you have any tips for the first round interview?
Well, this is an interview that's only going to be lasting approximately 15 minutes. Again, look at our criteria. You will see there that we're looking for oral communication skills, presentation skills, the ability to assimilate information and digest it and give us a response to it. So typically in the past, we've chosen some sort of topical question as a basis for discussion. In the past, we picked up on Donald Trump and his shenanigans, and we've talked about impeachment, and that's been great. That's been a great focus for getting the most out of the candidate. So come prepared to demonstrate flexibility of thought. That would be a number one tip. Number two tip is try not to be nervous. I mean, that's easy. That's easy for me to say, I think, who's you know, been in practice for many years and has read an awful lot of these applications, but we absolutely want you to give of your best. Yes, we have to make a decision on whether to take you through to the second round interview, but in arriving at our decision, we want to enable that interview process to be as probing, yes, but as friendly as possible. We absolutely want you to give of your best. And I'm sure, let's put Dan on the spot. I'm sure that Dan found that we were the friendliest bunch around, didn't you, Dan?
Okay, I just remember that you weren't actually on my so the answer was yes.
I mean, it is our aim to be probing but friendly. So come prepared to demonstrate flexibility, but try not to be nervous.
Great stuff, thank you. Now, the next stage in the process is the opinion that we ask them to write. Do you have any tips for candidates for that?
I think the most common mistake candidates make in writing this opinion, that we set them, I can't remember off the top of my head how many days in advance of the second round interview we set that work, but we certainly give a few days to look at a piece of you're given a legal problem, and it's to answer the legal problem. There's a real live client there. It's a real, you know, a pretend situation probably based on a case that one or other of us have dealt with in the past. As I said, the most common mistake candidates make in writing us a written opinion is setting out too much law at the expense of practical advice. So this isn't an undergraduate effort. This isn't giving us a treatise on, for example, the law of easements, if that's what the legal problem is about. Obviously, we want to see legal analysis, but my key tip is remember that you are writing an opinion for a solicitor and ultimately a lay client who wants to know the way out of their legal problem. So think about that. Think about, put yourself in their position when you decide how you're going to write this opinion. We've had, for example, in the past, a question about an easement and a farmer. Put yourself in the farmer's position. What does he want to know? Does he want to see 10 pages on the law of easements, or does he want some legal analysis so that he can see you know your stuff? And then does he want to know the answer to his problem?
Thanks very much. And now the final part of our process is the second round interview. Do you have any tips for candidates for that?
Yeah, again, during that second round interview, as I said before, there's a breakdown of the contents of that interview in our guidance on our website. So have a good look at that. It's divided into sections. We will talk about the opinion you've written. But a key aspect of the second round interview is this mock conference I mentioned. So candidates often find the mock conference the biggest challenge, because this will often be an unfamiliar scenario for the candidate. They won't before probably have been, on balance, put in the position where they've got to pretend to be the barrister, giving actual advice to a solicitor and a lay client. So although, again, we are looking for skills of legal analysis, because you'll be given a problem to discuss in the conference, what we're looking for here is how you communicate with your solicitor and client, how you respond to questions that they ask. Maybe it's a very difficult client. Maybe they've got some tricky questions for you. So brush up on your people skills, I would say, for the second round interview. And remember that you will be advising not only your solicitor, who does have some legal knowledge, but also your lay client, who probably doesn't have any legal knowledge, or at least unless you're told in the scenario that they do have legal knowledge, it would be reasonable for you to anticipate that they don't really know about all these detailed legal principles. So my tip for the second round interview is remember who your audience is and how you're trying to help them.
Great, thank you very much. And talking more generally, what does Radcliffe do to ensure that it reaches the widest possible range of candidates?
Well, as we all at the Chancery Bar are very much aware, and certainly in the last 5 or more years, this has been a focus of all pupillage committees at the Chancery Bar, is we want people from all backgrounds, we always have done, regardless of their background, to apply to us, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. And certainly in the last half a dozen year or more, we've got better at identifying those candidates and making sure we don't miss out on them. And one way we're able to do that is to use, and we tell you more about this on the website, is to use rare recruitment, which is a logarithmic software system that helps identify outstanding candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. We also involve ourselves in a variety of other initiatives, perhaps you're going to ask me about that later, to attract diverse candidates. We run a student camp for sixth formers, for example, once a year. Hopefully we're going to be back to doing that in person this coming year, because we've had to do it online for the last couple of years, or perhaps we'll be able to do both, actually. So again, that's another way in which we want to enable candidates who apply to us to see that we are a set of chambers who is very much wanting to attract candidates from diverse backgrounds.
Great stuff, thank you. Let's move on a little bit now to talk more about you, if we may. So could you tell the viewers what areas of law you practice in mainly?
Yes, a variety is the one-word answer. The more detailed answer is that I focus on private client law for the most part, and property law, and some taxation and charity law. So to break that down further, what do I mean by private client law? Well, that could be anything to do with private wealth, trusts, property, anything to do with the administration of estates, probate disputes, the battle of the wills, which will was the last valid will. We've got some great disputes along those sorts of lines in chambers. I do property work. That could be acting for developers. It could be helping the farmer I mentioned, who's got easement problems. Used to do when I was very junior. There would often be boundary disputes in my in tray. Tends to be the fodder of some of our junior tenants to do that sort of work. I also do taxation work, so that's particularly related to private client, in the private client sphere, so the taxation of trusts, for example, and I do related professional negligence work in the areas of expertise that I've mentioned. I mean, I could go on for another half an hour, but I think that's a reasonable summary.
Thank you. What do you enjoy most about your job, Kate?
I think if you'd asked me this question, let's say when I was at Dan's stage, I might have given you a slightly different answer. So when I was really, really junior, having just come from an academic history background, I think my first answer would have been, oh, what do I enjoy most? Oh, it's the intellectual rigor of the job. It's just being constantly challenged by the stimulating intellectual work we do. Now, that's still the case, but I think I'd slightly change the answer now by saying that, in fact, along with that, applying it in a practical sense means that you can solve problems for people. So that might be by writing an opinion, it might be by representing them in court and hopefully winning, but you know, in a way that really challenges the little grey cells. I think it's the problem solving. As I've got more senior, I've realised, yeah, actually, it's the helping people and the problem solving that goes along with that sort of intellectual rigour that's needed for the type of work that we do.
Great. And what do you find the challenging part of the job?
I think actually it's the reason why I enjoy it. The intellectual demands can sometimes be very hard. I'm not going to deny it. You know, occasionally, sometimes things are straightforward and you know, because of your experience, immediately what the answer to a problem is. Sometimes genuinely it's, oh my goodness, what's the answer to this question? I mean, don't think just because I've got those two letters after my name that, you know, everything comes easy. Sometimes the intellectual demands can, you know, still be very hard. But once you work out the answer to a difficult problem, I think, I don't know about you, you think, oh, I don't know why I found that difficult. The hardest thing suddenly becomes, you know, the thing you enjoy most because you've worked out the answer. I don't personally have a problem with, you know, managing my time, or I think because I enjoy my work so much, that whole sort of thing doesn't worry me too much. I used to, when I was more junior, I think the time management was perhaps a bit more stressful because you don't know so much, so you worry more and you need to take more time to look at things. But as I've got more senior, I've chilled out about that a bit more, I think.
You mentioned those two magic letters, QC. You were appointed QC in 2020. So could you tell us a bit briefly about that process and how Chambers supported you through it?
Oh yes, that was pretty horrendous. You have to fill in the most detailed application form on earth. It takes absolutely ages. And you have to satisfy a number of competencies by a process of giving evidence about a number of your cases. And you have to submit an inordinate number of people to whom the panel might go to provide an assessment for you. They don't go to all the people you've named, but they go to a number of them. If you get through that process, you are then interviewed and the decision is made with a combination of the what they think of your written application and what they made of you at interview. But I did have an awful lot of help from Chambers. I personally didn't sort of keep it a secret when I was applying, so I know some colleagues knew I was applying, so occasionally you know, they would be there for support and assistance. I had a lot of support from my clerks and from our Chambers CEO, Fiona, who believed in me, encouraged me, helped me with aspects of the form. I think what they were very good at doing is saying, Kate, you're really good at this, but maybe you're not, you know, this is maybe an area that you need to, that you need to brush up on, or you sell yourself well here, but you don't sell yourself particularly well here. So make sure when you're filling in the form. So it was great to be able to show my application form to colleagues and our CEO, who would say, you know, who would give an honest and frank opinion. I think having that honest and frank opinion from colleagues was really invaluable.
Great, and I'm glad to hear it all played out rightly. Thanks very much, Kate. It's now time to move on to the third part of our event, which is questions from all of you. And we've already had some questions coming in the Q&A box, so please do add any more you like. I'll start by throwing the ball back to Dan. So Dan, why did you want to be a barrister rather than a solicitor?
Yes, the sort of age-old question. I think, in short, it's for the two things that Kate and I identified as the best parts of the job. First of which clearly I prioritise, because etc. of the job is the freedom. Self-employment comes with various benefits, but as well, and I think this is particularly the case if you're comparing what we do with corporate lawyers or corporate solicitors at big corporate law firms. I think we are potentially closer to the law in terms of grappling with substantive legal disputes, getting involved with the fine detail and the case law and the legislation, etc. And it's the intellectually rigorous challenge of trying to find a way through that to ultimately come up with a legal solution. And I think it was those two things really which persuaded me to embark on this path rather than the other.
Great, thank you. Kate, what's Radcliffe's policy on applications from people who are changing careers?
Well, the first thing to say is that we welcome such applications. From a candidate's perspective, it would be important for them to explain to the panel in their covering letter why they were doing that. It would be strange to us to not to be able to understand why the candidate was changing career. So I would encourage any candidates who are thinking along those lines to explain that in their covering letter. No, if it enables a candidate to fulfill all those criteria that we are looking for, then that would be a good thing.
Great, thank you. Now, Dan, we've had this question from a couple of people actually. You mentioned that you applied to Radcliffe twice and you were successful on the second time around. What do you think you did differently?
Yes, I think just before I answer that, what I will say about if people are thinking about strategies and sort of building on applications and things, what I did was sort of file all my previous application forms, different covering letters and things that I'd sent off, together with any feedback that I might have received from the sets in question. And then before writing my applications for the following year, would go back, read what I'd written, and in particular for the round I was successful in compared to the year previous to that, I remember reading some of the things and thinking, crikey, I would never have written that in a million years this time around. So I think that's a really useful process, because often you can see, you spot things which you think that might have led to my not getting through. In terms of specifically me, it's difficult to say in some respects what it was that sort of got me over the line this time around. I think a really important factor was that compared to the previous year, I had a master's result, which it was a strong result, so that would have increased my score on the objective criteria, no doubt, that the Pupillage Committee uses. I'd also done a couple of other things, such as mooting competitions. I was at the time volunteering and sort of running an employment tribunal case with the Free Representation Unit. Again, I think that is, I'm sure you two will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is something that's probably looked upon quite favourably as being one of the closest things you can do before actually doing the job, to the job, if that makes sense. So I think the general answer is I just done a few more things that enable me to tick a couple more boxes, or maybe put a stronger tick in a couple of boxes than the year before. And it's that sort of incremental progress, I think, that I was looking to focus on between application cycles.
Thank you. Now, Kate, one of the things that applicants worry about the most is academic qualifications. So could you tell us a bit in particular about what Radcliffe requires from its applicants? For example, do they need to do a master's or a PhD?
They absolutely don't need to do a master's or a PhD. We do say in our literature, again, I keep saying the same thing, it's all in the brochure, or it's all in the policy statement, but we certainly would ask for a minimum of a 2-1 for whatever degree you've studied at undergraduate level. And we don't require master's or PhD. It's true to say, however, looking back over the years on, when I look back at all the applications, you know, there are some years where we have selected candidates for pupillage who have just finished their law degree. We have also chosen candidates like myself who, you know, did a DPhil and spent lots of years studying history. And I rather suspect all those years ago, I didn't have much commercial nous at all when I was taken on. But it depends. You know, doing a master's or doing a PhD doesn't necessarily, of course, give you all the skills that we are looking for and that we have identified on the website. If you do think that you need to stand out from the crowd a little bit more, you know, and you can afford it, and you want to do it for its own sake, then by all means I would encourage you. But it's not absolutely necessary to do graduate work simply to have a good chance of a successful application at Radcliffe. You should do that postgraduate work because you want to do it for its own sake, I would say.
Great, thank you. Dan, what's the culture like in Chambers, particularly for junior people?
Yes, in my experience of Chambers, and I think this was something that I was aware of before I applied, and particularly through there are a few, I think, Legal Cheek reviews, articles, etc., that go into a bit more detail about this. But I think Chambers' culture is incredibly open. I think the Chancery Bar maybe sometimes has a bit of a reputation as being old-fashioned and perhaps stuffy. That's certainly not the case at our Chambers, or certainly not what I've experienced. I mentioned earlier about members of Chambers across the full scale of seniority, from people 1 or 2 years above me to people like Kate, who are more than happy, if they have the time, for people to come into each other's rooms, have a chat, ask a question. And aside from that, I think what is encouraging, or what I found encouraging about Chambers, is that everybody broadly tends to get on with one another. There are always people who are going to have coffee with one another in the morning, or going maybe on Thursday or Friday for a drink after work. Through the pandemic, people were catching up on a regular basis via Zoom and other things. So I think Chambers is a very friendly place, which I guess counters as well that view that's sometimes expressed about barristers being or it being a lonely job, a lonely profession.
Thanks very much, Dan. Kate, you mentioned in your application to be a QC that you have to talk about your practice. But how do self-employed barristers develop their practice?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we are self-employed, and in order to survive in the marketplace, you know, there is competition for work. So it's a good question. It's something that we touch on in the interview process, because part of that is wanting to find commercially aware, or people who we think can develop commercial awareness. I mean, the short answer, I think there's a number of key features. You need to obviously be prepared to work hard. In order to do that, I would suggest you absolutely need to love what you do, because then it's easier to work hard. As a junior, certainly, you should rarely say no to work within your area. Don't take on too much, but if you can fit it in, don't say no to work within your area, and extend your comfort zone so that you're taking on, when appropriate, work beyond your chosen area. You know, if you want to get into a new area, again, stretch yourself a little. I think the other key thing that's not strictly related to the actual work you do, is make yourself easily available to your solicitor clients so that you are the go-to person. They want to instruct you because they know that you're available, you'll chat through things, you know, you don't just sort of, they don't just get the opinion on an email and then everything is silent. You follow up, you develop a rapport with your instructing solicitor. And then I think in terms of marketing yourself more generally, you need to develop a more of a public face as a barrister. That might be by writing articles, it might be giving talks. We run a junior programme in Chambers for junior solicitors to come and listen to our junior barristers talk on various areas. That's a great way of meeting solicitors, marketing yourself. When you're more senior, it might be giving sort of higher level talks about areas within your specialism, get to know, become a part of the conference circuit. Again, it's a subject we could talk about for quite some time, but those would be my basic suggestions.
Thank you very much. Dan, when you're first starting out, how do junior barristers actually find cases? Can you talk a bit about the process?
Yeah, so I mean, to start with the very basics, we get our cases, traditionally barristers get their cases from solicitors, so solicitors' clients will come to them with some sort of issue, dispute, and the solicitor might say, well, I think we need a barrister to go and do the advocacy in court or to give more specialised advice. Now, how do those solicitors choose that barrister? Well, that I suppose is $1 million question. For people of my level, I think really I'm relying on the reputation that Chambers, or people like Kate, for example, have built up for Chambers. And I think a solicitor might come to Radcliffe because we're well respected in the areas of law that we practice in. And it might be a case of a solicitor speaking to my clerks and saying, have you got a junior barrister available? Rather than at this level anyway, saying, we would like to instruct Dan. And I think, and you two will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong, that when as you get a bit more senior, you have repeat instructions from people who you've worked with before because they want to use you again, or because you become more specialised in a certain area of practice. People will look for your name.
Great, thank you. And we're running out of time, so I'll ask just one more question to Kate, if I may, because it's quite an important one. How is Radcliffe Chambers different to the other commercial chancery chambers, in your view?
Let's look at that from the perspective then of the applicant and the pupil. I think that's what you're probably getting at in terms of what an applicant can expect. I think broadly I've already touched on, as I won't say too much more about it, our inclusivity principle, our pro-diversity stance. We're on for the second year, I think, in a row now. We're on the Social Mobility Employers Index. We're really pleased to have got on there. In terms of something that's perhaps of more relevance to the pupillage process and doing pupillage, I think unlike a lot of chancery sets, we are very good at offering our second six pupils the opportunity to do their own instructions. So I think that certainly stands us out from a lot of chancery sets.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thank you very much to everyone listening. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but I hope you found this webinar useful. If you'd like more information, please do look at our website or follow us on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Apart from that, all that's left for me to do is to say thank you to Dan. Thanks, Dan. And thank you to Kate. Thanks, Kate.
That's a pleasure.
For kindly answering all my questions. And thank you all very much for attending and getting so involved. We hope to see you in a pupillage interview soon. Thank you very much. Good night.